Hey there my little dreamers, and welcome back to my channel. For this video I'm going to be reading part 1 of the abridged and retold version of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. I hope this helps you relax and drift off into dreamland. If you have any suggestions for stories you want me to read, send me an email at the address linked below in the description box. Okay, without further ado, let's get into it. Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Whatever the feeling of the man in question as he moves into a new area, the families around agree on it so well that he is immediately considered to be property of one of their daughters. "My dear Mr. Bennet," said Mrs. Bennet one day, "have you heard? Netherfield Park has been let out at last." Mr. Bennet had made no answer. "Do you not want to know who has taken it?" cried his wife impatiently. "You want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it." This was invitation enough. "A single man with a large fortune. His name is Bingley. What a fine thing for our girls." "Why?" "How can you be so tiresome?" scolded Mrs. Bennet. "You must know that I am thinking of his marrying one of them. You must visit him as soon as he comes." "I shall do no such thing. But Sir William and Lady Lucas are going for their daughters, and they never visit newcomers." "You must go, for we cannot visit him if you do not." "I shall send Mr. Bingley a letter to say he can marry whichever of the girls he chooses, though I must throw in a good word for my little Lizzie." "You will do no such thing. Lizzie is no better than the others, not half so beautiful as Jane, nor so good-tempered as Lydia. They are all silly, ignorant girls, but Lizzie is somewhat cleverer than her sisters." "How can you insult your own children in such way? You have no compassion for my poor nerves." "On the contrary, your nerves are my oldest friends. I have heard you talk about them for the last 20 years. Ah, you do not know what I suffer. But I hope you will get over it and live to see many rich young single men come into the neighborhood. But if 20 should come, it would still be no use, since you will not visit them." Mr. Bennet smiled. "I promise, my dear, when there are 20, I will visit them all." Mr. Bennet was such a strange mixture of humor, sarcasm, detachedness, and contrariness that after 23 years of marriage, his wife still did not understand him. Her mind was less difficult. She was a woman of small brain and uncertain temper. The business of her life was to get her daughters married. Its comfort was visiting and gossip. Mr. Bennet was one of the first to call on Mr. Bingley. He had always intended to, despite telling his wife that he would not. Till the evening after the visit, she did not know of it. He revealed it as he watched his second daughter trimming a hat. "I hope Mr. Bingley will like it, Lizzie," he said suddenly. "We will never know what Mr. Bingley likes, since you will not visit," said Mrs. Bennet resentfully. "Do not keep coughing so, Kitty. For heaven's sakes, have a little compassion for my nerves. You are tearing them to pieces." "Kitty times her coughs very badly," said her father. "I am not coughing for my own amusement," replied Kitty fretfully. "When is the Assembly Rooms ball, Lizzie? At least we shall see Mr. Bingley there." "A fortnight tomorrow, but we cannot speak to him. No one will have introduced us," snapped Mrs. Bennet. "I shall introduce you," said Mr. Bennet. The girls stared at their father, and Mrs. Bennet said, "Nonsense!" "Are all forms of introduction nonsense?" he asked. "What do you say, Mary? You are a young lady of deep reflection." Mary wanted to say something clever, but did not know how. "While Mary is thinking," her father continued, "let us return to Mr. Bingley." "I am sick of Mr. Bingley," cried his wife. "I am sorry to hear that. If I had known, I certainly would not have called upon him. It is very unlucky, for we cannot escape that friendship now." The astonishment of his family was just what he wished. When the first burst of joy was over, Mrs. Bennet declared that she had always expected it. "I knew it! What a good joke! Girls, what a good father you have got! Lydia, my love, though you are the youngest, I dare say Mr. Bingley will dance for you." "Oh," said Lydia, "I am not afraid, for though I am the youngest, I am the tallest." "Now, Kitty, you may cough as much as you choose said Mr. Bennet as he left the room, exhausted by his wife's delight. Mr. Bingley attended the ball at the Assembly Rooms with a small party consisting of his 2 sisters, the husband of the elder sister, and another young man. Mr. Bingley was good-looking with pleasant, easy manners. His sisters were women of high fashion. His brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, looked like a gentleman, but his friend, Mr. Darcy, drew the attention of the entire room by his height, handsome features, and the rumor of his having £10,000 a year. He was admired for about half the evening until he was discovered to be proud, haughty, and conceited, and not even his enormous estate in Derbyshire could save him from being thought disagreeable and unworthy of his friend. Mr. Bingley danced every dance and talked of giving a ball himself at Netherfield. Mr. Darcy danced only with Mrs. Hurst and once with Miss Bingley, refused to be introduced to any other lady, and spent the rest of the evening walking about the room speaking to no one except his own party. Among the most violently against him was Mrs. Bennet, who particularly resented his having slighted one of her daughters. Owing to the scarcity of gentlemen, Elizabeth had to sit down for 2 dances and overheard Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley talking. "Come, Darcy, I hate to see you stand about in this stupid manner. You ought to dance." "I certainly shall not. You know how I detest it, unless I know my partner. Your sisters are already dancing, and it would be a punishment to stand up with any one of the other women here." "I have never met so many charming girls in my life as I have this evening," cried Mr. Bingley. "You are dancing with the only pretty one in the room," said Mr. Darcy, looking at the eldest Miss Bennet. "Oh, she is the most beautiful creature I ever saw, but her sister is sitting just behind you, who is very pretty, and I dare say pleasant. Do let me ask my partner to introduce you." Darcy turned around, looked at Elizabeth, till catching her eye, he withdrew his own and said coldly, "She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me. I am in no mood to pay attention to young ladies who have been ignored by other men. You had better return to your partner, for you are wasting your time with me." Mr. Darcy walked off, leaving Elizabeth torn between anger and laughter. She told the story with great spirit to her friends and laughter, however, for she delighted in anything ridiculous. The evening passed pleasantly for the rest of the family. Mrs. Bennet was thrilled that Mr. Bingley danced with Jane twice. Jane was pleased as her mother, but more quietly. Elizabeth felt Jane's pleasure. Mary heard herself described as Miss Bingley as the most accomplished girl in the neighborhood, and Kitty and Lydia were never without partners. When Jane and Elizabeth were alone that evening, after their sisters were in bed, Jane confided how very much she admired Mr. Bingley. He is exactly what a young man ought to be, good-humored, lively, and kind. Handsome, too, as a young man ought to be, if he can possibly help it, Elizabeth said playfully. "I was flattered. He asked me to dance a second time," James said. "I did not expect such a compliment." "No? I did for you. But that is the great difference between us. Compliments always take you by surprise, and me never. I give you permission to like him." "You have liked many a stupider person." "Oh, Lizzie! You never see a fault in anybody. All the world is good in your eyes. I have never heard you speak badly of anyone in my life." "I never want to be quick to judge," Jane protested mildly. "I know," said Lizzie. "You are unique. To take the good of everybody's character and make it still better, and say nothing of the bad, that is a quality which belongs to you alone." His sisters seemed charming too. Lizzie, who was both more observant and quicker to judge than her sister, was not so sure. Within walking distance of Longbourn lived a family who were friends of the Bennets. Sir William Lucas had been given a knighthood for addressing the king when he was mayor, and now he occupied himself in being friendly to everyone. Lady Lucas was not too clever to be a good companion to Mrs. Bennet. Their daughter, Charlotte Lucas, was Elizabeth's particular friend. That the Lucases and the Bennets should meet to talk over the events of a ball was absolutely necessary, so the morning after they gathered at Longbourn to do just that. "You began the evening well, Charlotte," said Mrs. Bennet. "You were Mr. Bingley's first choice." "Yes, but he seemed to like his second better." "Oh, you mean Jane, I suppose. I heard that he thought her the prettiest woman in the room, but it may all come to nothing." "To overhear that comment was nicer than what you overheard, Lizzie," said Charlotte. "Poor Lizzie, to be only just tolerable." "Mr. Darcy is a very disagreeable man," said Mrs. Bennet. "If he ever asks you to dance, Lizzie, you should refuse him." "Mamma, I can safely promise never to dance with him." "Perhaps he has the right to be proud," said Charlotte, "being a handsome man from a high family, with all that wealth." "I could easily forgive his pride if he had not mortified mine," said Elizabeth. "Pride and vanity," announced Mary, finding words of wisdom at last, "are very different. Pride relates to our opinion of ourselves, vanity to how we wish others to see us." Lydia yawned. "Oh, be quiet, Mary." A quarrel ensued, which ended only with the visit. The Longbourn ladies and the Netherfield ladies soon began to pay one another visits. Jane Bennet's manners pleased Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, though they found her mother impossible and her younger sisters not worth speaking to. Nevertheless, they expressed a wish to get to know the two eldest Bennet sisters. Jane was delighted, but Elizabeth did not like them, feeling they were snobbish and sneering. Their approval of Jane, she thought, arose only from their brother's admiration. His high regard for Jane was obvious, and to Elizabeth it was equally clear that Jane was falling in love with him. No one else was likely to discover this, however, since Jane had an air of general cheerfulness and calm which kept her true feelings from showing. Elizabeth mentioned this to Charlotte Lucas. "It is a disadvantage to be so very guarded," said Charlotte. "Mr. Bingley undoubtedly likes Jane, but he may never do more than that without some encouragement from her." "She does as much as she can. If I can see what she feels, he must be a fool not to know it too," said Elizabeth. "But he does not know Jane as you do," Charlotte replied. "Though they meet fairly often, it is never for long, and always in large parties. Jane should make the most of every half hour. When she is certain of him, there will be time enough to fall in love." "That is all very well if you are only trying to get a husband, but Jane is not plotting that. She can only feel what she feels, and hardly knows him yet. She has not seen him enough to understand his character." "Happiness in marriage is entirely a matter of chance," said Charlotte. "Understanding your spouse before the wedding does not make any difference to your happiness in the marriage." "You make me laugh, Charlotte, but you know that makes no sense. You would never act that way yourself." Elizabeth was so busy observing Mr. Bingley's attentions to Jane that she was unaware of being observed herself by his friend. Darcy at first scarcely thought her pretty. When they next met, he looked at her only to criticize, but no sooner had he told himself and his friends that her face had no good features than he began to find it was made unusually intelligent by the beautiful expression of her dark eyes. Though he had criticized her figure, he was forced to acknowledge that it was light and graceful, and in spite of claiming that her manners were not those of the fashionable world, he was caught by their playfulness. Elizabeth knew none of this. To her, he was the only man who had not thought her pretty enough to dance with. He began to wish to know more of her. It was at a party given by Sir William Lucas that she noticed his attention. "What does he mean by listening in on my conversations?" she asked Charlotte. As she spoke, Sir William called out to her, "My dear Miss Eliza, why are you not dancing? Mr. Darcy, let me present this young lady to you as a very desirable partner." And taking her hand, he gave it to Mr. Darcy, who put out his own to receive it, but she instantly drew back. "I do not wish to dance, sir." "You dance so well, Miss Elizabeth, that this gentleman could not object to giving us all the pleasure of seeing you." "Mr. Darcy is all politeness," Elizabeth said with a smile, and she would not be persuaded. Her resistance intrigued Mr. Darcy, and he was lost in thought about the manner when Miss Bingley accosted him. "I can guess what you are thinking of." I imagine not. You are thinking that this is an intolerable way to spend an evening. I agree, the nothingness, and yet the self-importance of these people, and the noise, am I not right? You are wrong, replied Mr. Darcy. My thoughts were happier. I have been thinking about the very great pleasure which a fine pair of eyes in that pretty face can give. Miss Bingley immediately fixed her eyes on his face, and demanded, whose eyes? Miss Elizabeth Bennet's, replied Mr. Darcy. I am astonished, cried Miss Bingley. When do I congratulate you on your engagement? You will have a charming mother-in-law, and of course she will always be at Pemberley with you. He listened with indifference, but as his silence convinced her that her wit had struck home, she did not stop for the rest of the evening. Mr. Bennet's property, Longbourn, gave him an income of £2,000 a year. Unfortunately for his daughters, it would be inherited on his death by a distant male relative. Their mother's inheritance from her father was not enough to make up the shortfall. Her father had been a lawyer in Meryton, the nearest town to Longbourn. She had a sister living there who had married a lawyer in their father's firm, and another brother in London. The Bennet sisters often went to Meryton for shopping and to see their aunt. Kitty and Lydia went the most frequently, following the enticing news from their aunt that army officers had settled in Meryton for the winter. Every day added to their knowledge. They learned the officers' names and made their acquaintance. Mr. Bingley's large fortune could not compare, in their eyes, to the glittering braid on an officer's coat. They talked of nothing but the officers. After listening to them one morning, Mr. Bennet coolly observed, "You must be two of the silliest girls in the country." "How can you think your own children silly?" demanded Mrs. Bennet. "They are all very clever. I remember when I was a girl I liked a red coat myself, and if a smart young colonel with £5,000 or £6,000 a year came along for one of my girls, I could not say no to him." Mr. Bennet was saved from having to reply by the arrival of a note from Netherfield for Jane. "Well, Jane, what does it say?" "Make haste, my love, and tell us," said her mother. "It's from Miss Bingley," Jane said, and read aloud. "My dear friend, if you do not come to dinner today with Louisa and me, we shall die of boredom. My brother and the gentlemen are dining out with the officers. Come as soon as you can. Yours ever, Caroline Bingley." "With the officers!" cried Lydia. "Lucky them!" "Dining out!" cried Mrs. Bennet. "How unlucky for you, Jane." "Can I have the carriage?" Jane asked. "No, you must go on horseback, because it looks like rain, and if it rains you will have to stay the night," said her mother, taking her to the door with cheerful hopes of bad weather. Jane had not been gone long before it began to rain hard. The rain continued the whole evening. She would certainly not be able to come back. "Such a lucky idea of mine," said Mrs. Bennet several times, as if the weather were all her own making. But the next day brought a note for Elizabeth from Netherfield. "My dearest Lizzie, I am very unwell this morning, which I suppose is the result of getting wet through yesterday. My kind friends will not hear of my returning home till I am better. With love, Jane." "Well, my dear," said Mr. Bennet to his wife, "if Jane should die, it will be a comfort to know that it was all under your orders in pursuit of Mr. Bingley." "Oh, people do not die of little colds. As long as she stays there, it could not be better." But Elizabeth was anxious and determined to go see Jane. As the carriage was not to be had, and she was no horsewoman, she declared that she should walk to Netherfield. "How can you be so silly to think of such a thing in all this dirt?" cried her mother. "You will not be fit to be seen." "I shall be fit to see Jane, which is all I want," Elizabeth replied. She walked at a quick pace through field after field, jumping over stiles, springing over puddles, and found herself at last at Netherfield. She was shown into the breakfast room with dirty stockings and a face glowing with exercise. Her appearance created great surprise. That she should have walked 3 miles unaccompanied and in such weather was incredible to Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst. Mr. Darcy was silent. divided between thinking about the brilliance of her complexion and the boldness of her coming alone. Mr. Hurst was also silent, but he was thinking about his breakfast. Elizabeth found Jane very ill. She stayed with her till the clock struck 3, when Jane, feverish, with an aching head, was too upset to part with her. The ladies changed their offer of a carriage to take Elizabeth home into an invitation to stay. The servant was sent to Longbourn to tell the family and bring her clothes. Elizabeth joined the Netherfield party for dinner. The sisters said several times how shocking it was to have a bad cold, and how they disliked being ill themselves, and then thought no more of it. Their indifference towards Jane, when she was not right in front of them, restored Elizabeth to the complete enjoyment of her original dislike. Only Mr. Bingley showed real concern for Jane, and his careful attention to Elizabeth stopped her from feeling so much like the outsider she felt the others considered her to be. As soon as dinner was over, she returned to Jane. Miss Bingley and her sister began insulting her the minute she was out of the room. They decided her manners were bad, a mixture of pride and cheek. She had no style, no conversation, no taste, no beauty. She has nothing to recommend her but being an excellent walker, sneered Mrs. Hurst. Her appearance this morning, she looked really wild. Very nonsensical to come at all, Miss Bingley agreed. Why should she be scampering about the countryside because her sister has a cold? She looked so untidy. Did you see her dress 6 inches deep in mud, and shoes and stockings, too? What you say may be true, said Mr. Bingley, but I thought she looked remarkably well. I never noticed her muddy dress. You saw it, Mr. Darcy, said Miss Bingley. You would not like your sister to make such an exhibition. Certainly not. I am afraid that this adventure has rather affected your opinion of her fine eyes. Not at all, he replied. They were brightened by the exercise. A short pause followed, and then Mrs. Hurst began again. Jane Bennet is a very sweet girl, but with such a father and mother, and such common relations, she has no hope of marrying well. One of their uncles is only a lawyer in Meryton, Miss Bingley sneered, and they have another who lives in Cheapside, added Mrs. Hurst, and they both laughed. If they had enough uncles, enough to feel all of Cheapside, it would not make them any less agreeable, cried Mr. Bingley. But it must seriously affect their chances of marrying men of any consequence, said Darcy. To this Bingley made no answer, but his sisters heartily agreed. Elizabeth sat with Jane till she fell asleep, and then thought it was right, rather than pleasant, to go downstairs. The others were playing cards. She was asked to join them, but the stakes appeared high, and she said she would rather sit with a book. Miss Eliza Bennet, said Miss Bingley, despises cards. She is a great reader, and has no pleasure in anything else. I deserve neither praise nor such censure, said Elizabeth. I am not a great reader, and I have pleasure in many things. You have a delightful library at Pemberley, Mr. Darcy, said Miss Bingley. Tell me, how is your sister, dear Georgiana? Her manners, her performance on the piano? Oh, she is exquisite. All young ladies are accomplished these days, said Mr. Bingley. They all play an instrument and paint. I only know around half a dozen who are really accomplished, said Darcy. Then you must think being accomplished includes a lot more than that, Elizabeth said. Oh yes, to be truly accomplished, cried Miss Bingley, a woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and the modern languages, and besides all this, she must possess a certain something in her air and manner of walking and speaking, and her expressions. And she must add something more, said Darcy, in improving her mind by constant reading. Now I am surprised that you know any accomplished women at all, Elizabeth remarked. I have never met such a woman. Eliza Bennet, said Miss Bingley, when Elizabeth had left the room, is one of those young ladies who tries to attract the other sex by undervaluing their own. It is a mean, underhanded art. There is a meanness in all the arts which ladies use to capture men, said Darcy, to whom this remark was addressed. All cunning is despicable. Miss Bingley was not happy enough with this reply to continue talking on the subject. Mrs. Bennet, Kitty, and Lydia called at Netherfield the following day. Seeing that Jane was not alarmingly ill, Miss Bennet had no desire for her to get better immediately. "She is much too ill to be moved," she declared when she came downstairs. "We must trespass a little longer on your kindness." "She must not think of going till she is well," cried Bingley. "She shall have every possible attention while she stays with us," said Miss Bingley with cold politeness. The two younger girls had been whispering throughout the visit, and Lydia now asked Mr. Bingley if he would give a ball at Netherfield. Lydia was a well-grown girl of 15, and was her mother's most beloved daughter. She had high spirits and a natural self-confidence which the attentions of the officers had increased. "It would be shameful not to keep your word," said Lydia. "I shall tell Colonel Forster he must give one too." Bingley's answer delighted her mother. "As soon as your sister is better, you shall have the day of the ball." Elizabeth asked after Charlotte. "She was with us yesterday," Mrs. Bennet said. "She is so very plain, not like Jane. Do you not think, Mr. Bingley? Mrs. Lucas often envies us Jane's beauty. Jane was nearly snapped up by an officer when she was only 15. He wrote verses about her, too." "And so ended his love," Elizabeth said, blushing for her mother, while Caroline Bingley directed her eye to Mr. Darcy with a very expressive smile. "I thought poetry was the food of love," Mr. Darcy said. "Of stout, hearty love, maybe, but if the love is only slight, a good poem can starve it completely to death," Elizabeth replied. Mr. Darcy smiled, and the ensuing silence made Elizabeth tremble in case her mother said anything else. But Mrs. Bennet, Lydia, and Kitty soon left, and Elizabeth returned to Jane. The rest of the day passed much like the day before. When Elizabeth joined the others downstairs in the evening, she could not help noticing that Mr. Darcy's eyes were fixed on her. She did not think it possible that he could admire her, but to look at her because he disliked her was still more strange. She concluded he must be finding something wrong with her, but she did not care. Miss Bingley played a Scottish tune on the piano, and Mr. Darcy asked Elizabeth if she would like to dance a reel. She did not answer, and so he asked again. "I was trying to work out what to reply," Elizabeth said. "You can only have asked me that so I would say yes, and you could despise my taste. Since I delight in overthrowing such plans, I shall answer no, I do not. So now despise me if you dare." "Indeed, I do not dare." Elizabeth, having expected to annoy him, was amazed at his gallant reply. There was a mixture of sweetness and playfulness in her manner, and Darcy found he had never been so bewitched by a woman as he was by her. He really believed that were it not for the inferiority of her family, he would be in danger of falling in love. Miss Bingley suspected enough to be jealous, and her anxiety for Jane's recovery was founded on her desire to get rid of Elizabeth. "I hope you will give your future mother-in-law a few hints on holding her tongue," she whispered to Darcy, "and stop the younger girls running after officers. You must hang a picture of the Cheapside uncle in the portrait gallery at Pemberley." "Have you any other ideas for my domestic happiness?" asked Darcy, picking up a book. Miss Bingley was desperate. She asked him to look at her. Turning to Elizabeth, she said, "Will you walk around the room with me? It's refreshing after sitting still." Elizabeth was surprised, but she agreed. Mr. Darcy put down his book. Triumphantly, Miss Bingley asked to join them. He declined. "I can imagine only two motives for your exercise. Either you have secrets to discuss, which means I should leave you alone, or you wish to be admired, which I can do better from here." "Shocking!" cried Miss Bingley. "How shall we punish him for such a speech?" "Tease him, laugh at him," replied Elizabeth. "I never tease Mr. Darcy." "Mr. Darcy is not to be laughed at," cried Elizabeth. "That is an uncommon advantage. I hope it remains uncommon among the people I know, however, for I dearly love a laugh." "It is easy enough to make anything, even wisdom, seem ridiculous by a joke," said Darcy. "I hope I never ridicule what is wise and good," said Elizabeth. Foolishness amuses me, but I suppose you are free of that." "I have tried," said Darcy solemnly, "all of my life to avoid those weaknesses which lend themselves to ridicule." "Such as vanity and pride?" "Vanity, certainly, but pride, where the mind is truly superior, pride is acceptable, within reason." Elizabeth turned away to hide her smile. "Is your examination of Mr. Darcy over?" asked Miss Bingley. "What have you learned from it?" "That he has no defects. He admits it himself," said Elizabeth. "I make no such claim," said Darcy. "I have a temper. It yields too little. I cannot easily forget the wrongdoings of others. My good opinion, once lost, is lost forever." "You have chosen well. I cannot laugh at your defect." "Mr. Darcy," said Elizabeth, "you are safe from me." "Everyone has some fault in their character," he said. "Yours is a propensity to hate everybody." "And yours," he replied with a smile, "is to deliberately misunderstand them." "Do let us have a little music," cried Miss Bingley, tired of a conversation in which she had no share. She opened the lid of the piano, and Darcy was not sorry. He began to feel he was paying Elizabeth too much attention. The next day Jane was so much better that Elizabeth asked to borrow Mr. Bingley's carriage to take them home. Mr. Bingley agreed, with genuine sorrow, that they were leaving. To Mr. Darcy, however, it was welcome news. Elizabeth attracted him more than he'd like to admit to himself. He wisely resolved not to show her any admiration from then on, and hid his nose in his book until she had left. Jane and Elizabeth were not welcomed home enthusiastically by their mother. Mrs. Bennet had wanted them to stay longer, but Mr. Bennet, though he did not say so, had missed them very much. "I hope, my dear," said Mr. Bennet to his wife at breakfast the next morning, "you have ordered a good dinner today, as there will be one extra with us, a gentleman." "Mr. Bingley?" cried Mrs. Bennet. "Why, Jane, you sly thing, you never dropped a word." "It is not Mr. Bingley," her husband said. "It is someone I have never seen before in my life, my cousin, Mr. Collins, who, when I am dead, may turn you all out of this house as soon as he pleases." "Oh, him! I cannot bear to have that odious man mentioned. It is the hardest thing in the world that your estate should be entailed away from your own children, and if I had been you, I should have tried to do something about it." Jane and Elizabeth had often tried to explain to her the legal complexities of an entail, that an estate thus burdened must be inherited by the nearest male heir, but it was a subject on which Mrs. Bennet was beyond the reach of reason. "Nothing can clear Mr. Collins from the guilt of inheriting Longbourn, my dear," said Mr. Bennet, "but if you listen to his letter, you may be a little softened." "I am sure I shall not be. It was very wrong of him to write at all. Why could he not keep on quarrelling with you, as his father did before him?" Mrs. Bennet snuffed. "Listen," said Mr. Bennet, and he read aloud. "Dear Sir, the disagreement between yourself and my late father has always made me uneasy, and since his death I have wanted to heal the breach between us. Having been ordained at Easter, I have been fortunate to have been given the attentions of the righteous, honorable Lady Catherine de Bourgh, and now I gratefully live in the vicarage of her parish, where I will forever show respect to her ladyship and be ready to perform the rights and duties of the church. As a clergyman, I feel it my duty to promote the blessing of family peace, and if you can kindly overlook my being next in the entail of Longbourn, and not reject the offered olive branch, I beg to propose myself for Monday, November 18th at 4 o'clock, and shall probably stay a fortnight. I apologize for being the means of depriving your daughters, and assure you of my readiness to make amends, but more on this hereafter. I remain your well-wisher and friend, William Collins. Today, then, we may expect this polite, peacemaking young gentleman," said Mr. Bennet, and he folded up the letter. How can he make amends? Jane wondered. Elizabeth was chiefly struck by his attitude to Lady Catherine, and his kind intention of christening, marrying, and burying his parishioners when required. "He must be an oddity," she said. "He writes very pompously. Can he be a sensible man? I think not. There is a mixture of toadying and self-importance in the letter which promises well. I am impatient to see him, said Mr. Bennet wryly. It is not badly constructed, said Mary, though the olive branch idea is not original. To Kitty and Lydia, the letter and its writer were of no interest. He would not be wearing a scarlet coat, so he held no attention for them. Mr. Collins turned out to be a heavy-looking young man with very formal manners. He admired everything at Longbourn, the hall, the dining room, and the furniture, which would have touched Mrs. Bennet's heart, but for the mortifying thought that it would all one day be his. At dinner, Mr. Bennet led him on to talk of Lady Catherine, hoping to be entertained. He could not have chosen better. Mr. Collins was eloquent and in her praise. She is all condescension, and she has actually asked me to dine at Rosings twice. There is nothing that she's not interested in. She has advised me to get a wife, and she has called on my humble abode and instructed me to build shelves in the cupboards. Shelves, eh? She must indeed be a great lady, said Mr. Bennet. I think you said she's a widow? Does she have children? She is a charming daughter, unfortunately sickly, which prevents her from an active life. I told Lady Catherine that the British court has thus been deprived of one of its brightest stars. I also said her daughter seemed born to be a duchess. These are the sort of little remarks which please her ladyship. You have the talent of flattery, said Mr. Bennet. May I ask if these remarks come from the speed of the moment, or are the result of previous study? I amuse myself with planning elegant little compliments that can be adapted to all occasions. I try to give them as unstudied an air as possible. Mr. Bennet's expectations were fully answered. His cousin was as absurd as he had hoped, and he listened to him with the keenest enjoyment. But when dinner was over, he had had quite enough. Mr. Collins was not a sensible man, and the deficiency of nature had not been helped much by good education or company. He had come to Longbourn expressly to choose a wife from one of Mr. Bennet's daughters, to make amends for inheriting their father's estate. He thought it an excellent plan, full of suitableness and generosity on his part. Jane's lovely face confirmed his views, but a tete-a-tete with Mrs. Bennet the next morning made a small alteration to his plans. I must just hint that my eldest daughter is likely to be very soon engaged, Mrs. Bennet told him, but my younger daughters— Mr. Collins had only to change from Jane to Elizabeth, but it was done while Mrs. Bennet was stirring the fire. Mrs. Bennet trusted she would soon have 2 daughters married, and the man she could not bear to speak to yesterday, today she was prepared to love. Later that morning, every sister except Mary wanted to walk to Meryton. Mr. Collins was going to go too at the request of Mr. Bennet, who was anxious to get rid of him for a while. Mr. Bennet liked reading in his library, but Mr. Collins kept following him there, talking incessantly. In Meryton, their attention was caught by a handsome young gentleman whom they had never seen before, walking with an officer Lydia knew, Captain Denny. Captain Denny introduced him as Mr. Wickham, who had just joined the regiment. As they were all talking, Darcy and Bingley rode down the street. Bingley bowed and said they had been on their way to Longbourn to ask after Jane. Darcy bowed and, determined not to fix his eyes on Elizabeth, caught sight of the stranger. Elizabeth happened to see them as they looked at each other, and was astonished. Both of their faces changed at once. One turned white, one red. What could be the meaning of it? It was impossible not to be curious. In 1 minute, Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy went on their way. The Bennet party called on Mrs. Bennet's sister, Mrs. Phillips. Mr. Collins, on his return to Longbourn, delighted Mrs. Bennet by his praise of Mrs. Phillips, for she had included him in an invitation for the very next evening. He had never met such politeness, he declared, apart from Lady Catherine's. Elizabeth was delighted to hear that Mrs. Phillips had also invited Mr. Wickham. He was the happy man to whom all the woman's eyes turned when he entered, and she was the happy woman he sat next to. The agreeable way in which he immediately fell into conversation, though it was only about it being a wet night, made her feel the commonest, dullest, most threadbare topic might be made interesting by the skill of the speaker. She held back from asking him about Mr. Darcy, but her curiosity was unexpectedly relieved. "How long has Mr. Darcy been staying here?" Mr. Wickham asked her. "About a month," she replied. Then, unwilling to let the subject drop, continued, "He has a very large property in Derbyshire, I understand." "Yes, a noble estate, a clear 10,000 a year. You could not have better information than from myself, for I have known the family from childhood. I was the godson of Mr. Darcy's late father, and my father was the steward of Pemberley. Do you know Mr. Darcy well?" "As well as I ever wish to," Elizabeth said warmly. "I've spent 4 days in the same house with him and think him very disagreeable. Everyone around here thinks him horribly proud." "His behavior to me has been scandalous," said Wickham. Elizabeth listened eagerly as Mr. Wickham continued. "I did not set out to be a soldier. The church ought to have been my profession. Mr. Darcy's father, the kindest gentleman, left me a very valuable living when he died. But when a position became available, Mr. Darcy gave it away elsewhere." "Good heavens!" Elizabeth exclaimed. "How could the will be discarded? Why did you not get to take legal action?" "There was just enough informality in the wording as to give me no hope from the law. No man of honor would have doubted the meaning, but Mr. Darcy chose to. He dislikes me because his father doted on me rather than him." "Shocking! People should know about this," cried Elizabeth. "I could never make it publicly known. In memory of his kind father, I think I could never do such a thing." Elizabeth thought his feelings were noble, and thought him handsomer than ever as he expressed them. "It is strange that his pride did not make him behave better," she said. "He has family pride. He is generous to his tenants, and he has brotherly pride. You will find him well spoken of as a careful guardian to his sister Georgiana." "What sort of girl is she?" "I wish I could call her amiable. She is too much like her brother. Very proud. As a child, she was fond of me. She is a pretty girl, about 15 years old, and lives in London with a guardian." Mr. Wickham's attention was now caught by hearing Mr. Collins talking to Mrs. Phillips about Lady Catherine de Bourgh. "Did you know," he asked Elizabeth, "that Lady Catherine is Mr. Darcy's aunt?" "I did not. I had never heard of her till 2 days ago. Her daughter, Miss de Bourgh, will have a very large fortune, and it is believed she and her cousin, Mr. Darcy, will marry and unite their estates." Elizabeth smiled as she thought of poor Miss Bingley, whose efforts would all be in vain. The evening ended, and all the way home she could think of nothing but Mr. Wickham and everything he had told her. The next day, as they walked in the garden, Elizabeth told Jane what Mr. Wickham had said about Mr. Darcy. Jane was astonished. It was not in her nature to question the truthfulness of such a pleasant man as Wickham, nor could she believe that Darcy was as bad as he had been painted, or Bingley would not have him as a friend. There must be more to the story on each side. "It is difficult indeed," she said. "One does not know what to think." "One knows exactly what to think," said Elizabeth. They were summoned indoors by the arrival of Mr. Bingley and his sisters with their invitation for the long-awaited ball at Netherfield, fixed for the following Tuesday. The two ladies were delighted to see Jane, but avoided Mrs. Bennet, did not say much to Elizabeth, and said nothing at all to the others. They were soon gone again. Everyone in the family was pleased about the Netherfield ball. Mrs. Bennet was certain it was a compliment to Jane. Elizabeth thought with pleasure of dancing with Wickham. Her spirits sank when Mr. Collins asked her to keep the first 2 dances for him. She had hoped Wickham would ask her for those very dances. There was nothing she could do apart from accept with good grace, but Elizabeth began to suspect Mr. Collins's gallantry of hiding a deeper purpose, that she was the selected sister to be the mistress of his vicarage and dined sometimes at Rosings with the great Lady Catherine. As for Kitty and Lydia, and even Mary, Tuesday could not come too soon. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed part 1 of this revised and retold version of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Actually, I really hope you're asleep right now, or at least relaxed. See all you dreamers in my next video. Good night.